An evolutionary account of moral and political progress. But at the same time, I think that this kind of problem-solving idea of progress needs to be supported by some kind of idea of adaptation. That is to say, an idea of how and why certain modifications in the moral and political order are selected and transmitted to the next generation. And I think that this is a possible problem, if not clarified, because an idea of adaptation opens up to many questions which are vital for such an account of moral and political progress. For example, the question of maladaptive, or in this case a regressive change connected to progressive or adaptive change. I mean, we could have a situation in which a certain kind of norm which is considered to be a progress for a society, at the same time requires another kind of change in the moral political order, which is actually seen as a regress. And this is basically the same problem which anthropologists such as Boyd and Richardson highlighted when talking about cultural change. So the fact that you can have situations where an adaptive behavior brings forth also maladaptive modifications to culture and behavior. So what I want to ask is if your account of moral and political progress has a conception of adaptation which supports it, and if so, if you can say something about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think so far my hunch is to be parasitic on however that objection is addressed in the literature on ethical progress. And so I don't know whether the kind of distinctive problem of adaptation that is distinctive to political theory different from whatever arises in moral theory. So it seems to me that, and we could have a larger debate about that, but there's a whole range of responses in the case of moral theory to this adaptation problem, and to talking about cases of maladaptation, which is often actually parasitic on evolutionary biology. And so they would say, well, of course you also have this problem in nature, you know, there's all kinds of failures and monsters and so on, but that doesn't make the evolutionary account in itself invalid. It just raises issues that have to do with explaining the performance of particular organisms, and in the case of morality with particular institutions, in the case of political theory with particular institutions. But I don't know how much that is an objection. I mean, although I take the point that it is a kind of general objection to any evolutionary account of anything, both sort of in biology and in morality and in political theory, I don't know that there is anything that one has to be worried more from a political point of view as opposed to, let's say, a more general moral point of view, and that my hunch would be to just cite forces with the moral theorists and say, well, however one responds to these issues of maladaptation from a moral theory point of view, one would draw on the same kind of resources. And one answer that is raised from a kind of moral theory point of view is to say, well, let's take seriously the kind of normativity nature, the normativity of human agency, and the idea that kind of the intrinsically practical character of reason, one would say from a Kantian point of view. So the idea of the moral ought as always operating, and therefore granting that there is a tension between, let's say, cases of preferences that are manipulated and so on, which doesn't take away, and that's a sort of empirical objection, which doesn't take away from the kind of reason-giving ability of moral agents, and to say, well, there's always a trade-off between the two, but there might be resources there. I know that doesn't, I mean, this is a very big problem, so this is a very short answer, but that would be the direction of developing the response, I think.
Lea, recently there was a debate in moral theory about the so-called debunking explanation, and one of the ideas is that we could distinguish between an evolutionary understanding of theoretical reason, which is perfectly viable in realistic terms, because there is, after all, an evolutionary function of truth, while in the case of morality, we have more problems because it seems that there is no connection between evolutionary pressures and moral truth. And that was what Sharon Street claimed. Now, I wonder whether this problem could be inherited and also could be even greater in the political realm. Because the idea is that if I have a debunking explanation of anything, and I'm, let's say, in some way oppressed or simply disadvantaged by a political regime, then I can use this debunking explanation to subvert. Now, that could be a virtue of your account, but also could be a kind of inherent instability machine, because anything could be debunked. I can be disadvantaged because I'm a very wealthy person that I'm paying taxes, so I can debunk it. So I wonder whether you have the kind of solution to this problem.
Well, I don't, but maybe Kant's moral theory has it, and this is where I started by sort of talking about this project as something that was initially inspired. And I think the answer is there to say, yes, but human beings are always, there's a kind of demand for reason giving and for justice that is not possible to suppress, however much you are an oppressed minority and so on. So I think the whole argument is actually parasitic on taking and acknowledging that point. And if you don't think there's anything to normativity or to sort of practical reason or to the kind of, to the moral ought, as it were, which is what was my initial title, it's very difficult to be on board with this project. And I think you can only go along with it if you take seriously this demand, which is the drive for justice is something that is inherent in human nature, and that's why we say that justice is the first virtue of social institutions and so on. And that's what triggers then the attempts to respond in different ways, and also the scrutiny of political institutions as more or less adequate in responding to this drive, this demand for justice. If you don't think, and this is where I think practical philosophy and moral philosophy, and then by implication also political philosophy, has the resources to address this kind of debunking issue, which is to say it's not just a question of theoretical reason, it's also a question of practical reason, because practical human agents have the kind of distinctive feature of agents taken from a practical perspective is that of following the kind of the moral ought and listening to reasons and giving reasons for their action. Once that gets going, then it's a question of thinking about how do you refine that ability throughout this generational process that I've been talking about, which doesn't vindicate all forms of rule and doesn't necessarily, as I say, make progress a necessity or send you back to a kind of linear way of thinking about history and political institutions as evolving through history. But I think it does somehow respond to this dilemma of the kind of the empirics of domination and oppression and the normative side of things, which is what is crucial to the debate on progress, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. So I was a bit surprised by, I'm not sure I really followed everything. I was surprised by the first objection where you said, how can you have this notion of progress without appeal to a standard? And it just struck me that you were appealing to a standard, and it just sounded like the standard of what's in contemporary political philosophy is called republicanism, which is to make power accountable and reduce domination, and you've got progress if you do that, and you've got regression if you don't. Otherwise, I just don't understand how you distinguish between progress and regress.
Right, yeah, so I agree with
Is it just republicanism?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, sure, but the point is that I wasn't contending the use of standards. I was just thinking about how do you think about where these standards come from, and so what is the reflection that might lead to us thinking, okay, well, the Republican standard might be the right one, thinking about forms of rule and so on. So I don't have any problem with being with saying that means that you are then committed to a particular way of thinking about decision making that might be close to republicanism. I'm not hostile at all to that. I'm very open. The question is, what I'm trying to think about is how can we place that in a narrative of thinking historically about political institutions that places that in comparison with other forms of reason giving and regime types and so on, and what is it that makes us able to say, well, this seems like a plausible way of making decisions, this seems like a right regime type, and so on. And that's where I was trying to link to this, to responding to the kind of dogmatic objections. Well, we've thought about this, and this is the right one, or as opposed to thinking about it in more evolutionary terms and saying, well, this is how we've come up with this idea. Is that clear?
I think so. You're contextualizing republic.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, but I'm hopefully I'm contextualizing it hopefully without relativizing it. which is the other thing, because then you have the skeptic's answer, which says, well, okay, but now that means that it's contingent, and it's only because it's our idea, and this is the kind of arrogance of the present, which says, well, you've come up with this idea, so of course you think it's a good one. And what I'm trying to say is that there might be something to the plausibility of this that is not, doesn't mean it's up for grabs and relativistic.
Emanuela. I was wondering if you could say something more about the idea of functional refinement. Thanks. Because I very much like the way in which you contrast, or in fact you draw an analogy between altruism and power and the function they play in normative theorizing. And I can see how the idea of progress as a refinement, as a functional refinement of program of justice works in cases of regime change and institutional transformation. But then I'm a little bit puzzled with reference to the examples that you quoted in at the beginning of the talk in terms of anti-slavery movement and enfranchisement of women, where there doesn't seem to be, I'm not sure whether it's a refinement of normal justice that occurs there, but it's more a matter of expanding the domain where certain norms of justice are applied. So if your concern with progress is also to make sense of what goes on in that case, how does that fit with your account of progress in terms of functional refinement of norms?
Great, thanks. And I think the reason, so the answer is that I'm concerned not just with the substantive norms of justice, but also with the ways in which we discuss, because the idea is that given a plurality and reasonable disagreement and so on, it might be very difficult to settle on substantive norms of justice. And then we have to move one step further and think about ways in which we make decisions. And then the example of the enfranchisement is one where it seems that there is a kind of exclusion from voice that is important to contributing to making certain decisions and so to being part of the demos, which is itself, it seems like a progressive transition because it's one that allows the voice-giving process and the feeding and the scrutiny of the exercise of power to be more inclusive. Whereby in the case of the slaves or in the case of women, one would say, well, this set of institutions is regressive because the ways in which you make decisions and the procedures that you use to assess the institution are themselves deficient. So I want the account to be able to be self-correcting, not just in the generation of substantive standards of justice, but also in the generation of procedures that generate substantive standards of justice. And that's where the reflection on democracy and enfranchisement comes from, and also the comparison between democracy and other forms of rule, so aristocracy or oligarchy or whatever. Does that?
Just very quickly, can't you say that in that case you simply expand the number of people to whom certain rights are given, and it's a matter of distributing rights, which is a matter of what you call substantive justice?
But sure. Well, yes, but what is interesting for me, and I don't know whether I should disagree with what you just said. What's interesting for me is the accountability of power structures, and the idea is that justice is increasing justice is what makes power structures more or less accountable. Increasing it makes them more accountable, and decreasing them makes them less accountable. And so I don't know if that means that in the end it's a substantive versus procedural question. What I'm interested in is how there seems to be a part of the constituency that is being against which power is being exercised without them themselves having a voice in the way in which power is being exercised. And if one then thinks about justice as refining this mechanism through which power is exercised, then it would seem that this transition is a progressive one because it contributes to the way in which, to the accountability of power, basically.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was wondering about, however, how politically progressive the forces of evolution are. I recently read an interesting book about multi-level cultural selection, which pointed out that actually early human communities of hunter-gatherers were extremely egalitarian to the point of having no private property. And then about 3,000 years after the invention of agriculture, everywhere extremely unequal states started appearing systematically and driving them out. And then, of course, a bit later, equality seems to be again functionally useful. So what does this mean for revolutionary political account, that egalitarian was fit to competition at one point and at another wasn't? And how hope should we have that this trend towards more equality continues? But perhaps most importantly, should we judge the value of equality compared to how fit it is to evolution in a specific context?
So I don't know if it would help if I clarified that what is at stake in this project and what the reason I'm talking about evolution, but the way in which I use the term evolution is different from how it's being used in evolutionary biology, where people are only interested in selection and survival. So in this account, if you're thinking about political progress and the refinement of justice norms, it's clearly not about sheer survival, because you could survive in all kinds of ways, and it's about normative survival, as it were. So it's about the kind of survival of the process of the procedures and the process through which reasons are shared, such that power is constantly scrutinized. And I'd have to look at the specifics of the case, and then I might say, it might well be that there was a progressive moment at the dawn of humanity, and then it's disappeared, and now it's emerging again, and it's progressive again, whereas it was regressive in the middle. But there might be all other kinds of factors one would consider. But I think it's important for this project to specify that it's not just about selection, cultural selection, understood as whatever results from history going forward. And so whatever we have now is actually, we have the right institutions, because otherwise one would be back to this critique of the Enlightenment accounts of progress, which is what I was mentioning earlier, which is that it builds into a kind of arrogance of the West and thinking about the way. So hopefully the idea is to come up with an account of selection which is not about sheer survival, but it's about the survival of the better reasons and how fit they remain throughout history in terms of being responsive and being able to address the concerns and commitments of people, and responsive from a normative point of view. And that's where the pressure is all on justice rather than any, there could be all other ways in which you might think about power and something else. It could be about welfare, it could be about happiness, it could be about, the reason I focus on justice is that I want to preserve the normativity.
Well, I am not a political philosopher, and I miss most of the subtleties of the discussion. So my question is very naive, and maybe you may laugh at it because I don't know the topic actually. But my intuition is that political progress is realized when there is more space to freedom of movement, freedom of choice, freedom of a religion, freedom of behaving the way you like. And I don't know whether this development of progressive political institution can be accounted only in terms of normative justice. So I don't know if there is a specific feature of enhancing freedom in a progressive society.
Yeah, but you ought to be able to negotiate freedom and the freedom of different agents in society. And usually, often in debates about justice, from Rousseau to Kant to Rawls, the idea is that justice is what you need to appeal to in negotiating the freedom of different agents, and sort of in constraining freedom and also guaranteeing that the freedom of each is compatible with the freedom of everyone else. And so even though you might be right that freedom is a kind of higher order ideal, when it comes to political institutions and political authority, in attempting to guarantee this freedom of individuals, one needs to negotiate freedom, and that is done by appealing to justice in a certain tradition of thinking about political theory and what political theory is about, right?
Thanks. So I'm generally very sympathetic with sort of an explanation of the moral evolution in terms of, progress in ideas that, ethical ideas that were already there since the beginning of ethical thought. Okay, so a kind of progressive refinement of ideas that were already there. We're still discussing Plato's problems, and we are doing that with a more refined insight. But then in the presentation you gave at some point, I had the impression that in this history, this evolution of morality, there are some gaps. and some unexplainable gaps. So when you talked about the passage from a society of slaves to a society to a less aristocratic society, and you said that at some point certain ethical alternatives become epistemically accessible. How can you explain that passage? It seems like a complete jump that as you're explaining a moral evolution, an evolution in the ethical thought through maybe an exogenous variable. Okay, something has happened outside in the social world. Maybe you're relying on a kind of a Marxist explanation. Okay, something has changed in the mode of production, and therefore there's been a change in the ethical view. So, exactly, I'm not sure whether your history of ethics is a history characterized by continuity, or whether there are gaps, and how can you explain these gaps?
Thanks. I think the point in the paper in which I mentioned that is the point where I say that we shouldn't think that all good things happen for good reasons. And I want to be open to the suggestion that there might be that good reasons sometimes prevail for not good causes, right? So the point in the argument in which I was kind of emphasizing how there might be different means through which, let's call it an ethically superior alternative emerges, is where I want to concede to the critic that maybe there is just war, or that doesn't mean that we are unable, in the course of reflecting about these different means, to then say, well, this one, from a moral point of view, is the most desirable, right? And that's where it's also important for my account to keep thinking about the procedure and the refinement of procedures, because even though we can grant that empirically, let's call it the superior ethical alternative emerges for all kinds of reasons, we still want to be able to look at the transitions and identify those transitions that are more compatible with the ethical standards and those that are less compatible with the ethical standards. And I don't see why saying that we can detect these differences means that if we say, well, this is a superior one, means that we are then unable to reconcile that with saying, but empirically, it happened for a bad reason, right? So that was the point in the paper in which I emphasized that sometimes it can be the use of power or this kind of these Marxist mechanisms. But that doesn't obscure the normativity of the agent that I was insisting on at the beginning, right? The idea that that human beings are practical reason-giving agents, and that's kind of, there's something essential to them about that.
Any more questions? Sorry. Any more questions? Okay, I think it was a very long day. We should thank our speakers. And I have a very short announcement to make. There is a social dinner, as you know, which is at 8:15 at the restaurant I Tremelli in the Old Fort. It's very